This session is called, Is There a Future for People's Tribunal? And I will attempt to speak to that title and thereby to lead into the discussion that is going to follow. It's a pity that Michael is temporarily out of the room as I start my remarks by yielding to irresistible pressure to break an inflexible rule of advocacy and most other forms of public speaking, namely that you should never speak about any aspect of your personal history or about yourself at all. And I break the rule for two reasons connected with Lewisham Hospital. I was born there. Having been born there, when life in England was very different in 1957, we had things called fogs, pea super fogs, that were so thick you literally could not see beyond your nose. It's a matter of debate whether life in England is more transparent now than it was periodically then. But on a December night in 1957, late from school and having to walk home because there were no buses in these fogs, walking along Canadian Avenue, a couple of hundred yards from the town hall building where the Lewisham Commission sat, I heard an almighty sound carried through the fog from the Lewisham railway line, where the then worst Lewisham train crash occurred. 11 were killed, and many were injured. And I mention it because they were taken to, and on records, I think, extremely well cared for by that same Lewisham Hospital. A little indulgence. Let me now lead into the subject matter of this short session with two other experiences that are, I hope, relevant, although they may seem to point in opposite directions. Last year, I found myself addressing a conference in Seoul, to which I'd been invited and which I'd been reluctant to attend because it seemed a long way to go for a short contribution to what would be a small conference dealing with the North Korean problem. When I arrived, I found it was a very large conference, filling a very large hall, hundreds of people, and that I was what's called the keynote speaker, a task I manfully or otherwise fulfilled before finding that the effects of jet lag, at which I'm not very good at dealing with, were taking over, and so the rest of the day passed intermittently with eyes open and eyes closed. I was accompanied by an extremely helpful and efficient graduate law student as my interpreter, who reminded me shortly before the close of proceedings that I was also giving the closing remarks. Unable to deal with detail, I had to work on the general impression I had received from the speeches, which were all to a single effect: that these NGOs and other representatives of the interests of the North Korean people wanted only one thing, and that was a reference of the problem of the North Korean people to the International Criminal Court. They were absolutely focused on it. And of course, the South Koreans, just like the North Koreans, have been subject for decades to very authoritarian rule, in their case successfully, in North Korea otherwise. And it may be as part of that general upbringing, for them, a single focus was all they could really have, or so it seemed. We knew then that surprisingly, the Human Rights Council had appointed a commission to inquire into North Korea. We knew it was about to report. We expected the report would be favourable. The entire audience was focusing on that report working and the referral to the International Criminal Court following. With that in mind, I addressed them in terms that reflected what Hamid and I found. I told him about it, but he was in the outside of the room concerned. When we were at the Human Rights Council in Geneva a few weeks ago, dealing with an Iran issue, but by chance, Judge Michael Kirby, the presiding member of the North Korea Commission, was addressing a group of Japanese. Now, Michael Kirby was the ideal judge to appoint for this commission. He loves publicity, self-publicity, any publicity, and he's really good at it. So he knew that you had to write an immensely strong report, which he did, and that you then had to push it, which he did, in England and the Netherlands and everywhere else. But when I stood for a couple of minutes waiting for our Iran event to happen and listened to him, what he was saying to the audience was, for goodness sake, remember, unless you act and act and act again, this report may, like all the others, land up on the shelf. And it was with that in mind that I was able to close the Seoul conference by saying to the people, look, maybe I should not reveal Northwestern European cultural impressions of Oriental faces that seem to me to bear a certain common passivity. I said to them, look, you simply must not allow yourselves to focus too much on this single objective, because you simply may not get it. And if you fail to get it, you will be downhearted. The energy that you've drawn on to fill this hall will vanish, and the cause, whatever it may be, that you seek to serve will go unserved. So that message could be, whatever you're doing with a People's Tribunal, make sure it's part of a larger mix of activities. But the second experience goes in exactly the opposite direction, or does it? The Iran Tribunal, on which I and others have worked, was an exceptional process, because people famous for not being organizable, if that's a word, capable of being organized, from around the world came together and worked with single-mindedness for a single objective. And you saw in the film yesterday, I think a truly remarkably good film. You saw how that bringing together of energy, work, and financial resources to the extent necessary achieved a single objective, which was to have our informal tribunal. That's different then, isn't it? One, have a mix of activities. Two, have a single objective. And for us in the Iran Tribunal, the problem now is to decide where to go next. Because for us, having no single next objective that we can realistically achieve, there's the risk of the dilution of enthusiasm, of energy, and the disappearance of resources. I've learnt a great deal from these last days, day and a half, learning a surprising amount that I should have known earlier about the number of tribunals there are doing the number of different things. Immensely encouraging, but I believe revealing of the essential problem that lies at the root of the question that is posed for this session. And I hope you will indulge me by taking part in a very small experiment. I'm going to ask a few of you a question that I want you to answer without thinking and with a one-sentence answer. Is there a problem?
No.
Oh, right. In which case, I shan't pick on you first, Payam, but maybe second. So, a single sentence answer without reflection. What, Hamid, was the objective of the Iran Tribunal?
The judgment condemning Iran.
What, Michael, is the objective of the Russell Tribunal into Israel-Palestine?
Was to galvanize the international community into taking action.
What, Shakoufe, was the objective of the Iran Tribunal?
Condemnation against Iran.
Sorry?
Condemning Iran as a crime, committing a crime against humanity, according to the international law.
I suppose I could go on, but do you see already that there is no absolutely common thread in the objectives spoken of by people? That's not in any way to diminish the value of the tribunals, but it's to point up that, as I think our first speaker but subsequent speakers said yesterday, what these tribunals do is part of activism, which can take any number of forms. I was much impressed and interested by the range of tribunals spoken of by the People's Permanent Tribunal, for which I think very different answers might come, and about which I must learn a great deal more. But we are, in fact, part of activism, whatever that means. We are really part of politics. And that makes it difficult for two things to happen. First, because we use a broadly similar title for People's Tribunals, Commissions, whatever you like, we think, well, the activity of this other body that has the same name that we have will in some way in the public image lend support to what we do. It will give collateral power, collateral authority, because they'll see us as part of this same family. But it doesn't work like that. Not only is the average citizen not aware of any particular tribunal, he or she is not aware of the idea of these tribunals generally. And therefore, to look at what one may or may not be doing, or to read about what one may or may not be doing in the newspaper, doesn't persuade her or him that this must be a good and a powerful thing and a thing to take seriously. The politician should be worried about because it's part of a family of other events. They see it, and the politicians see it, as each of them individual activities that can be picked off. And I think that's something that we ought to have in mind as we look at, address, and try and answer this difficult question. Because there is no doubt but that individual tribunals doing the work they are doing with the mix of objectives they have can carry on and achieve a great deal. But it will always, I think, be on the same basis that has thus far been shown. And when I said yesterday, not dismissively of tribunals, but just simply factually, that they are easy to forget, it's because they are individual events. And the public just doesn't have that much capacity, why should it, to remember, assemble, put together in some synthesized way all the events in their consideration. And so once it's gone, it's gone. And can there have been, for example, in England, at the domestic level, a more important example of people power than this event that Michael spoke of, and yet what percentage, Michael, would you say of the ordinary citizen knows about it now?
Only people who live in Lewisham.
Yeah, or people who were born there. So there we are. And that is a real problem for us to face and to deal with. What's the solution? I received from Hamid a flight of fancy. No, but it's a flight of fancy that is proper to make, because unless you can live in the imaginary world that is better, you can't begin to move the world that is worse in a positive direction. And in any event, what Hamid said was a reflection in poetic terms of something that I'd already dealt with or started to deal with elsewhere. But both his version and my version have real difficulties, as I think we shall see. But his version would be to imagine an international tribunal set up by the United Nations that has jurisdiction over all member states without needing their agreement, without member states being able to opt out or to impose conditions for joining. No ratification by member states are required. Imagine, he said, that such a tribunal had universal jurisdiction on all breaches of human rights committed by government, state organizations and individuals. Imagine, he said, that every individual or class of individuals who are citizens could have the right to file a claim. Imagine that the threshold for filing a claim would be simple. And he went on to deal, imagining the powers that such a tribunal would have, totally different, both in concept and reality, from the politically tortured tribunals that Michael and I have appeared in and have to work with and sometimes against. Now, that's one thing you can imagine, you can think about in a better world. I had a slightly similar version of that at the practical level, and I started the business of approaching a Dutch politician about it, but things got stalled, and I might pick it up again, which is, why should not Holland, home of so much international justice, elect to set up a cost-neutral, so it would have to be funded, and in all other ways neutral tribunal that would offer to competing parties or parties that address it a cadre of experienced judges and maybe of lawyers to whom applications could be brought without further reference or authority of the international community or of national governments for them to determine. So that, to take the Iran case, we could move from the informal tribunal to taking the case to the court, and depending on how the mechanism might operate, the court either takes over the investigation or it allows the party to present its case. It provides the judges. Well, you can imagine that having some appeal and some use in certain circumstances. But there are, with that version, as with Hamid's, real and obvious technical problems. First, there is funding. Our tribunals tend to work on no money at all, or no money beyond what's necessary for transport and hotels of people flown around as necessary, and witnesses. But you can't go on doing that forever. There is virtue in working for nothing in certain parts of but you can't expect a major international development, if that's what you might be looking for, to work on that basis. So if you were going to do either of these systems, you'd have to have funding. And you simply couldn't have a completely open door to any applicant, because you'd simply have too many, I suspect. So you would have to have some process of filtration. But nevertheless, I hope that that has one way ahead may at least be worth having in the back or in the side of your mind as we answer this question, and we're going to answer it very soon by the panel discussion. If I'm right, and we have still to look at people's tribunals individually, then it is easy to see that some can, probably the Russell-Israel-Palestine tribunal is the best advance, some can achieve publicity, and by publicity, power, because eventually their work draws enough support from enough people that it cannot be disregarded. Others, and maybe, and this is the concern for our Iran tribunal, others may never be able to have that effect for a range of reasons. But, and we can discuss them more particularly later. And the question then is, what should such tribunals, and there may be many of them, do? With what will they be content? And if they reach the position of contentment, do they then disband and say there's nothing else to do? What should we draw from the way the Comfort Women Tribunal brought great something beneficial things to the women who were still alive, but that it is now very hard to find on the internet? Try and find the judgment of the Women's Comfort Tribunal, and I found it extremely difficult.
It is actually there. All you have to do is Google it.
Well, I've Googled it.
I lose it. Takes me about a minute, and I got it when I've lost it. So
there you are, the magic touch. But generally, the point is still there, that once something's done, is it over and finished with? With the Iran tribunal, once we've set a record, if we get knocked back by the UN, if we get knocked back by the other agencies to whom we apply, and if we don't have the sort of power that the current Israel-Palestine conflict can give to a tribunal, should we say, that's it, we've done our work, we've left a record? And the answer to that question is going to be in your hands following our discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you.